Those commercials are a lot longer for me than they did for you. And we'll get into why that is in a little bit. So my name's Ian Murray. I've been shooting short form for about over 20 years now. I started in the late 90s. And I've had quite an interesting career, sort of traveling around the world, shooting, experiencing a lot of film at the beginning. So when I first started shooting, the industry was very, very different to the way it is now. Almost unrecognisable, actually. I mean, back then it was quite a small, tight-knit group, and the barriers to entry were pretty high. So, getting a chance to sort of shoot on film, to try and convince someone that you could successfully shoot a production on film was a lot harder than it is now with all the technology we've got. But what I wanted to talk about was the fact that I've sort of had quite a long career, and I've seen lots of changes in the industry, and I've been very fortunate because when I started as quite a lot of money going into commercials at the time, because there's only 5 channels on television, and so it's quite a captive audience. So the budgets tended to be quite big. So we got to work with all kinds of different technologies, and we got to experience basically the best technologies, the latest technologies. And as my career progressed, I started sort of honing it down into the elements that I found the most useful for me, and started simplifying the process. But the one thing that sort of stood by me for the whole of that journey was my love for light and how light sort of affects me emotionally. So I wanted to start the talk really with a little story of when I was a child. When I was a little feral kid that used to play in the woods and build camps in the woods. And I had a little wooded area quite close to where I live, but between my house and this wooded area, there's a long winding alleyway, and it didn't have any artificial lighting. So I'd be out playing in the woods, and I'd be very conscious of the sort of time of day, and particularly when it grew to the sort of evening time and the night drew closer, I'd get this sort of feeling of excitement, a sort of ominous excitement, knowing that I had to get back through this alleyway, and it was quite frightening, particularly if someone was coming in the opposite direction. So from quite an early age, I became very sensitized to different times of day and different light. And really, as an adult, I kind of sort of recreate that. I still have that kind of connection to the little boy. So even though I've had quite a long career, and it's as I say, it's gone through different stages, that's the one thing that's been a constant. So my first point is, as humans, as filmmakers, we're interested in emulating the human experience for dramatic effect. And now, as an adult, when I'm shooting, I'm basically applying the same emotions I had as that little child. I'm sort of trying to recreate them on a film set, using sort of my sort of film techniques. So that's the one sort of, like I say, the one thing that sort of stays with me. And so when we perceive the world as humans, we're basically turning our perceptions into kind of emotions. And I think that's core to cinematography. So for a deeper understanding of cinematography, we need to have a deeper understanding of that process, that visual process of perceiving something and processing it into emotions. So the talk today, basically, is to try and break that down a little bit. So we're going to go into the anatomy of the eye, and then we're going to talk about some of the latest sort of theories of how we process images. And I'm going to try, as best I can, try and relate that back to the filmmaking process, right? So, one thing I should say, actually, is this talk's an hour, and I've got half an hour. So I managed to talk them into another, 10 minutes, providing at the end of the talk, everyone exits quite quickly. So are we all up for that? Is that kind of like is that a good deal, that we all exit, and then I can talk for another 10 minutes, if that's cool? Okay, so let's start with the anatomy of the eye. So let's get the first slide up. So, I mean, most of you are probably familiar with how we basically process an image. It's very similar to a camera. So we have a lens, and that diffracts light. Actually, that's the second slide, I think. Just advance it one. Is that me? Yeah, here we go. So we have a lens, we have an iris, much like a camera. We project the image onto a photoreceptive layer called a retina. And in the retina, there's rods and cones, and the cones are responsible for, they're light sensitive, they're color sensitive. So we have RGB cones, red, green, and blue cones. And then we have rods as well. And rods are more sensitive to light, but they only produce a monochrome. So that's basically how we see. You would think that the eye, and actually the title of this talk was how the eye is the greatest lens ever created. Well, it's a little bit disingenuous of me, because actually the eye is actually not as great as we think it is, and that's what I'm going to get into now. So let me just get to my next note. So if the eye was a camera, it would actually be quite a badly designed camera. And this surprised me when I was doing my research. So the first problem we have with the eye is that we have a rear-facing retina, which is kind of absurd when we think about it. It's basically equivalent to having your camera sensor facing the back of the camera and not the lens. So in order for light photons to reach the photoreceptive part of the retina, they have to travel through quite a labyrinth of nerve endings and capillaries, and they have to actually go through the retina to the actual light-sensitive part of the retina, which is facing away from the lens. And that just blew my mind when I found that out. And the second problem we have with the eye is we have a massive blind spot. So I don't know how many people are aware of this, or have anyone's done a little YouTube. You can find on YouTube tests that's actually visualizing your blind spot. Has anyone done, show of hands, has anyone done that? So not that many of you, actually. So let's just have a look now. So if you all put your hand out and you look at your thumb, the area of your thumb basically is not about 8 or 9 thumbs widths along is your blind spot in each eye. So it's equivalent to basically a little disc either side, which actually is completely blind. And the reason for that is if we go back to the previous slide, as you can see the shot here of the retina here, you can see that all these, like I said, this labyrinth of nerves has to come through to the optic nerve here. And where they pass through, it's called the optic disc here. And that's got no photoreceptor cells at all. So that's our blind spot. Now, we don't have an experience of that. And the reason we don't have an experience of that is because there's a whole huge amount of visual processing that's going on that fills in our blind spot for us. But as I say, if you go onto YouTube, you can do tests and you can actually see it playing out, which is quite shocking. And the third flaw with the eye, and actually the one I think is the most significant, is a bandwidth bottleneck, right? So that thumb width we looked at earlier, so each thumb width of our field of view, there's only about 9 to 10 neurons connecting our eye to the optic nerve for that area of photoreceptor, which is startling, really. It's equivalent to watching a 4K movie using a dial-up internet connection. So it doesn't explain sight in a convincing way. It's like our eyes are very flawed, yet we have this experience of sight, which is quite baffling. Next page. So the way, the scientists, what they believe is going on, actually just put it into another perspective, that snapshot that we see of the world is equivalent to a 1 megapixel image, right? So our eyes, because of this bandwidth problem, this bottleneck, we're only experiencing 1 megapixel shot of the world, which is not our conscious experience of how we see, right? We see in, we'd argue, higher resolution than 8K, right? But our actual processing, the actual sensory information is very, very minimal. So what they believe is happening, what the scientists believe is happening, is there's like a feedback loop going on between the sensory part of the eye and the higher visual processing, and it's creating a kind of like a network, a kind of labyrinth network effect of algorithmic kind of processes that results in our experience of vision. So it's kind of like a camera phone. When you have quite bad hardware on a camera phone compared to a professional camera, yet there's a huge amount of software happening in the phone to create this kind of, like with a modern iPhone, this sort of feeling of, depth of field and, the color science and everything that goes into that. It's mainly software and with very substandard hardware, much like, how our eye performs. So what the neurologists believe is we don't passively see the world as our assumptions might lead us to believe. We're actively generating it. So it's like a controlled hallucination that we're experiencing. We have assumptions, predictions, and expectations of what's going on around us, and we have this controlled hallucination. We're all experiencing this hallucination because we're all experiencing it together. We call that reality, when actually what we're having is we're having a hallucinatory experience where very small amounts of sensory information are being reined in by this kind of feedback loop. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at that. So are you all up for that? And I'm going to show you that. Now, some of these things you might have seen before, and some you might not. But let's start with our first example. So this is a vacuum molded face of Charlie Chaplin, and it's just a vacuum mold plastic. So it's got convex side, concave side. And as it rotates round, what you'll see happens is your mind constructs a face. Now, that face isn't happening in reality. It's probably going to happen around about now, where there's a mind-constructed face going in the opposite direction to the mask. Is everyone experiencing that? And then the weirdest thing is when you actually project a nose facing outwards from the limits of the mask. And as the mask gets to the edge, you'll see that nose falls away, because our expectations were that's a face. We're designed to recognize human faces wherever we can. So let's see it one more time, just so you can experience it again. So first you see the convex mask, and then you hallucinate the face coming towards you. And that nose is pointing outwards, but then it can't be pointing outwards as a mask comes along. So that's an example of a controlled hallucination there. And there's another example here, which this one completely blows my mind, right? So has anyone seen it? Who's seen this one before? Yeah, you're nodding. Yeah, because it's absolutely crazy, isn't it? So these boxes aren't moving at all. They're not moving. I have to keep saying they're not moving, right? We are basically hallucinating the movement of those boxes now. It's pretty crazy, huh? And what's even crazier is those arrows are indicating which way we should be seeing it. So we're taking a very small sign, like a semiotic sign, and because we understand that to mean something, we're hallucinating the effect of that. Now, the one way of basically being able to sort of try and break it down so you can see it's not moving is if you take a section of it and just, like, as someone's doing in the audience now, put your hand up and just take a section, you'll see that section's not actually moving. It's just flashing, and it's tricking our eye into thinking it's moving. So does everyone agree it's not moving now? Yeah? So what's happening? I must be hallucinating that, right? Okay, and there's a third example if you're up for it. And this one is kind of equally crazy. So if you look at the spinning girl, which way is she spinning? Clockwise or anti-clockwise? Yeah, now look at if you think clockwise, look at the corresponding side. And then look at the woman in the middle. They're all spinning together, right? So if you look at them, they're all spinning together, but then they're not. They're changing direction. So if you look at one woman spinning anti-clockwise, and then a woman in the middle spinning anti-clockwise, if you look at the other woman spinning clockwise, and the woman in the middle switches to spinning clockwise. And then if you look at all three of them, they're all spinning in the same direction. So again, it's like we hallucinate, we're constructing we have expectations on what a woman in silhouette looks like, and we project a three-dimensional image of how we feel that woman should be. And we're hallucinating the full experience of that. And there's one more example, and this one is called a lilac chaser. So what we need to do is we need to be a bit proactive in this one. We all need to stare at the square in the middle of the screen. And there's going to be three illusions that happen here. The first illusion is you're going to see a complementary colour flashing. Well, the first thing is you're going to see movement. You're seeing a circular movement. But that's actually not real movement. That's just flashing. So our mind's constructing the movement. Secondly, you're going to see a complementary green colour. And if you carry on staring at the disc, at the square in the middle, then eventually what happens is all of the pink discs fall away. And the reason for that is that the first one's called the phi phenomenon, where we see things moving that aren't really moving. The second one is the after image of how we perceive colour, that we'll get into later. And the third effect, when they all disappear, is because our brain basically sees the unchanging colours as unimportant. So we're constantly looking for patterns. So the big question is, why have we evolved to be like this? Why are we like this? So in evolutionary terms, it was first thought that our race, our human race, evolved through accurate sight. So we had hunter-gatherers in the past, and they had accurate sight. The ones that had more accurate sight would be more successful, and they would carry on the genes, right? But now the evolutionary scientists believe that that's not true, actually. They actually do studies for this, and they've worked, because evolution is actually a mathematical equation, right? So you can do computer-generated studies, and they've actually worked out that the people that see truth, see reality, they become extinct quite quickly. It's the ones that see what they call fitness, which is the way we're designed to sort of try and procreate long enough, try and survive long enough to have babies, which is what our evolutionary genes want us to do. So now the biologists don't believe we've evolved through accurate sight. They believe we've evolved through selective sight. So our perceptions guide adaptive behaviours towards a survival advantage. So social and practical skills that keep us alive. There's a fantastic talk, actually, by this guy called Donald Hoffman that breaks this down, and he equates our whole visual experience is akin to a desktop operating system. So we're actually not experiencing reality at all. Reality, the quantum field of reality, which we can measure as a scientist, we have no direct relation to that, which they call the hard problem in science. There's no correlation between our nerve responses in our eye, all this stuff that goes on in our eye and the nerve responses in our brain, and experiencing a sunset. There's no correlation between that. So we have to be hallucinating that. So we don't see everything. We see what matters, right? The full information of physical reality would be way too overwhelming for our nervous system, so we wouldn't be able to function, right? So what we're seeing is we're seeing a breakdown of the things that, as I say, are important to us in terms of the evolutionary process. So everything that we have, that we see is what's helped us as a human race stay alive, and it's not the truth, the physical truth of reality. So, so we're unconsciously selecting things. So do you want to see an example of that? Up for an example of that? Now, again, a lot of you guys might have already seen this, so please, if you have, don't spoil it for the people that haven't seen this, because this one is pretty breathtaking. So how many passes does the team in white make? So concentrate, count the passes, tell me afterwards how many passes. We're going to check who's got it right. So how many passes do you get? Shout it out. 13, right, yeah, good. Well done. But did you notice the moonwalking bear? Let's rewind that, watch it back again. So here he comes. A little bit of a move, bit of backsliding. So we selectively filter out, what's not important to us. So we got a visual task there, counting the passes. We don't notice the moonwalking bear. So we do this selection in two processes. One of them is we selected the whole electromagnetic spectrum to the visible portion of the spectrum, which our species, humans, we only have a very, very narrow bandwidth of what we're sensitive to, and everything else we totally disregard. And the second way we filter things is through prediction. So we predict what's about to happen, and that's very, very important for us. So it's akin to the way we broadcast a television signal. We're not interested in sending the whole image pixel for pixel, because that would be too much bandwidth. So what we do is we break it down, and we look at what's called the difference information. Yeah. So if you have someone on the football pitch, someone playing football, and the pitch is pretty much staying the same, and that person's moving around, we don't broadcast all of the information on the football pitch, because that's staying the same. What we broadcast is what's difference from frame to frame, right? And it's what they call the newsworthy information, is what is broadcast, not the whole information. So, so deviation from prediction is more important. It's a more effective way of passing information through with regard to television, and the same thing is happening with regard to sight. So we're only noticing what's, as I say, what's important for us to notice from a biological perspective. So firstly, we're only sensitive to a small portion of physical reality. And that small part of the portion of physical reality, we then have a secondary filtering process of what we believe is deemed to be newsworthy information. So we're making a lot of predictions based on our expectations, right? So let's have a look at that now. There's a couple more I was going to show you, just in case people have seen this one before. There's another example here. So what's wrong with that picture? Anyone? Some people, I can hear some people saying it, right? So what we look at immediately, most of us look at the dirt in the teeth here. What we don't notice is she's got an additional finger. And again, if we look at this one here, we notice the dirt, but we don't actually notice there's a floating limb here. So again, it's like through our expectations of what we perceive as being important, we filter a lot away. So now, this can be also shown in the way we perceive a three-dimensional space. So as I mentioned, we're constructing that three dimensions in our mind. That's not really, that's clearly a two-dimensional screen, so that's all a construction. But, rewind. Okay, so let's just see that again. So you saw half the effect then, but A and B, they look like different tones. Would you agree? So our assumptions of what the three-dimensional space should look like, we make assumptions about light and shade, and because that is in the shade, we assume the same, a different tone, a lighter tone, but in fact they're the same tone, as you can see. So people, you've seen this one before, right? Most people seen this one? Yeah, so you know that that's a fact. That there's not a sleight of hand there. That's actually how we see things. So again, looking at it again, B looks a lot lighter than A because of our visual assumptions on how three dimensions work. And there's another one here. This is more about perspective. So, sorry. Can we pause this one at the beginning? Is that possible? No, we can't. Okay. So anyway, this has kind of been ruined. So, but basically, the table in black looks more squat than the table next to it, but in fact, it's our assumption of a three-dimensional space, and you'll see when it gets moved over, they're in fact the same. Okay, so let's move on. So let's move on to what's called foveal sight, right? So let's go back to a picture of the eye again. So as I mentioned earlier, the light comes in through here, it gets refracted and focused onto a focus point here, the fovea here. And that's where the concentration of cones are. So cones, as I mentioned earlier, they're responsible for colour vision, and they're also responsible for sharp vision. They're not as sensitive to light as the rods, but they do give us our sharpest, most colourful vision, whereas the rods are more spread out in the periphery around here, and they're more sensitive to low light, but they don't give us a sharp colour image. So therefore, our sight is concentrated in the centre, right? And then you can do a little exercise to see this. And it's so simple. You just get two thumbs, put them right out in front of you, and focus on one of your thumbs, and move the other thumb slightly away. And you notice so quickly that second thumb becomes soft focus. So you keep your vision on one thumb, and as that thumb moves away, it becomes very soft very quickly. So the way we kind of perceive sight, the way we think we're seeing, is we think we're sort of like a camera, we're taking a snapshot of reality. Well, actually what we're doing is we're foraging for fitness, for biological fitness, and we're using a very centrally weighted, sharp image to do that. So it's like akin to being kind of a sniper and looking around the sort of three-dimensional space of things that provides some kind of survival advantage for us. So one of the things, now finally bringing it back to cinematography, right? So one of the points, as I can never understand why why moonlight was blue when I was a child. I thought, well, why is moonlight blue when physically the sun's being reflected off a grey mass? It should look the same as daylight, right? And it doesn't. It's very different to daylight. It tends to look softer than daylight and has a kind of more silvery quality, right? And the reason for that is not the physical reality of that. The reason for that is our perception of that. So, the cones are more active at night. The rods are the cones are shut down at night. The rods are more active. So we're actually perceiving something to be more monochromatic. And because cones aren't as sharp because rods aren't as sharp as cones. I'm dyslexic, so I'm always mixing rods and cones up. Because they're not as sharp as, the rods aren't as sharp as cones, you're seeing a softer image. So that's really important as filmmakers, because what we're doing as filmmakers, we're emulating that human experience. So what we're trying to do is trying to move other people's emotions. So creating a physical reality of what moonlight isn't going to do that. So what we're doing is we're constantly, as cinematographers, we're constantly trying to create our emotional impact on a scene rather than actually what might be happening in reality. So the other thing about foveal sight is something called saccades. This is the concentration here. I should have shown you this one earlier. So this is the concentration of the colour cones, and they're broken down here into the RGB here. And as you can see, rods on the side and cones in the centre. And that's as you can see, rods are just sensitive to that portion of the bandwidth and nothing else. And we have 3 colour cones that's sensitive to the RGB spectrum. Oh, that's coming up. So the second part of foveal vision is to talk about saccades. So because we are only seeing a central sharp area, what we do is we're scanning an area very quickly and we're taking in information. Now that's not our sense of vision. Our sense of vision is a smooth kind of process of kind of scanning a room or whatever. But if you actually put your fingers on your eyelids and you just rest them very gently on your eyelids and you just look around the room, you'll notice what's happening is you're getting these really rapid little movements of the eye, and they're called saccades. And they happen actually they happen 3 to 4 times every second. So it's actually faster than our heartbeat. So quick little moves. And what we're doing is we're mapping an image and creating a three-dimensional map of that in our minds, in our higher realms of the visual processing. So this, for me, relates to our choice of lens. So I guess a few of you here will kind of have this assumption that a 42mm lens, or between a 35 and a 50mm lens on full frame, is akin to our sort of experience of human vision, right? Is that something you guys have heard before? Yeah? So, but I would argue that. So maybe when you're looking at the field of view, there's something in that. But basically, our experience of human vision really goes where our attention goes. So if we're looking at someone's face, if I'm looking into someone's eyes, I'm you know, like a 1000mm lens or something. And if I'm standing on a landscape and just taking in a panoramic view, I'm more like a fisheye lens. You know, I'm opening my vision up to my periphery, right? So this is important when it comes to lens choice, because basically we are, like I say, we're emulating this human experience. So our different choice of lenses is a different choice of that kind of experience. So if we're very focused on something, then we tend to use a longer lens on that to isolate that from the surroundings. And then if we're taking in a landscape and we're trying to produce a different kind of emotional effect, then we use a different lens for that. So when you think of focal length, you're really thinking of emotional impact. So I oftentimes think of it as a visceral or cerebral effect. So I find that long lenses, for example, kind of create emotional distance, and I find them more cerebral. When I find wider lenses being closer into someone, it's a more visceral experience, it's a more gutsy experience. So again, every lens, every focal length where you place the camera all has an emotional impact, and to be more consciously aware of those impacts it has, and to make your choices based on your emotions, how you see the world, I think is really key. And so, for example, the character of lenses, going back to this foveal vision characteristic we have of sight, the fact that we see centre-sharp images and the rest falls off, but we process a lot of that out. That's our choice. The fact we love anamorphic lenses so much, the fact we like vintage lenses so much at the moment, I think it's got a lot to do with foveal vision. Because, you know, these old lenses, they're very sharp in the centre. Well, not even always very sharp. Sometimes they're adequately sharp in the centre, but they fall off very quickly into soft, you know, colour aberrations and all kinds of stuff, right? But we find that emotionally something we can relate to, and I think the reason for that is because we all have foveal vision. So there's all something in us, deep down in our soul, that can relate to that. And that's why the character of lenses I find so interesting. And the stall next door to this talk is Cooke, for example. I really like using Cooke lenses, and one of the reasons for that is because I find Cooke is the only manufacturer that actually doesn't make stills lenses, and because of that, they can kind of try and emulate the human experience of motion more kind of believably. And so what they do is they tend to have a more centre sharpness and have this kind of like sort of dimensional centre, and it falls off in a way that I find very, very pleasing. Because with cinematography, we're moving through a space, right? So we don't read the lens characteristics in the same way as a still image. A still image is it's a static image that we're scanning with our eyes, with our foveal vision. We're scanning this image and we're taking the edge-to-edge sharpness, and we're taking it all in. So it's very important for it to be flat plane with edge-to-edge sharpness, where with motion picture, it's more important for it to have dimensionality and to draw the viewer through the space, right? So we're going through a space, right? So that foveal vision kind of that look that Cooke has, that kind of foveal look, I think is really interesting. And another thing to mention on that point is that we have a binocular field of view and a monocular field of view. So we have two eyes. Well, most of us have two eyes that are functioning. And because of that, we have depth perception. And that range of depth perception is an angle called the monocular angle. And beyond that, we go, the binocular angle with depth perception. And beyond that, we go into a monocular. So what we're seeing is we're seeing a three-dimensional space in the middle of our vision, and we're seeing it more two-dimensional either side. And again, that's very much like how Cooke lenses are designed. They're designed to have this sort of dimensionality in the middle. And if you compare them to other lenses that are more designed for stills, you'll see that's very apparent. Okay, moving on. So the other thing to mention with the last thing to mention with foveal vision is how it affects our nervous system. So when we're focusing on something, we're switching on the parasympathetic part of our autonomic nervous system. And that's actually a higher stress rating, and it means we're focusing on something, all our attention is going on something, and it has a kind of, you have a kind of more alert status. And then when we're looking at more of an open space and we're switching off, sometimes you can get it just by daydreaming. You know, like when you look at your wonder wall, you can feel your nervous system calming down, and part of the reason for that is because you're not actively engaged in that searching, zeroing in foveal vision, and that when you do that, you're switching on the sympathetic nervous system, so you're actually calming yourself down. So it's an interesting thing to experiment with. When you're focused, just like I said, becoming aware of how vision works is so important. So, just when you go home tonight, maybe look at the horizon and notice how that calms your spirits. And then when you really focus on a car rushing past you, notice how that puts you into an alert kind of fight-flight response. So again, it's all of this. The point of the talk today is to really say, become aware of something in your visual field. Become aware of how you see, and then consider it, and then try and emulate that on a film set. And that's really the heart of what cinematography is. So let's move on now to our hunter-gatherers. So as I said, we're evolution. There's a lot of evolutionary biology in how we process images. And our hunter-gatherers, they were designed for aiming and throwing. Our whole body is designed for throwing, right? And we're designed for aiming at things. Our whole vision, the foveal vision, it's all about zeroing in. Our ability to see and to zero in on things is second only to birds of prey in the whole animal species. We are brilliant at zeroing in and aiming at things. And that's why when someone scores a goal, everyone cheers, because it's just so second nature for us to want to see something, aim at a target and to want to see that target getting hit. It's something so deeply embedded in our nervous system. We zero in, we forage for food, we forage for a mate. That's basically what our biology wants us to do. So there's no surprise to me that framing is second nature to that, because what we're doing as filmmakers is we're disregarding everything that's unimportant. We're going through that filtering process we spoke about earlier, and we're focusing on what's important in that frame to try and move another human's emotions, right? So it's a very, very second nature to us. It's a learned developmental process from our ancestors. And the way we move the camera is very similar to the way our ancestors would, like, say, track a prey on the horizon or something. We have very strong emotional correlations between how we move a camera and how we feel. So the next part to talk about is how the foveal vision. How am I doing for time? 8 minutes. Shit. I'm not even halfway through this. So reading human expression. So that's a really very important part of the reason we have foveal vision, because as well as kind of trying to get sustenance through, killing animals and, finding berries, all the things, we also want to be able to understand our social dynamics and our place in a social setting. So what we're doing is very, very interested in human faces. So we're constantly scanning someone else's face for trying to understand what emotions are going on beneath that. And that's why in cinematography, I try and, when I try and teach film lighting, for example, I teach people to light the portrait first, try and understand the mechanism of the human face and how to elicit emotions from the way you light a human face before you get into worrying about how the set's lit. So I often think about a film as being a sequence of portraits that are all giving different emotional responses, and those strung together become a film, in essence. So it's us looking at human faces, trying to elicit emotions from those human faces is absolutely core to our understanding of reality. You can look at that example, for example, as the way, an example of that, I should say, is a way of, if you look at magazines on a bookshelf, the vast majority of magazines are usually beautiful women, sometimes men, staring out at you in an evocative way. They're trying to engage your interest. So it's 95 or something % of magazines have that, because it's something that, as humans, we really respond to. We respond to someone showing us interest. We're actually the only animals that, in comparison to apes, for example, we have whites of eyes. So being able to spot the direction someone's looking in and see emotions in someone's face is kind of key to the success of our evolution. Okay, so moving on now, let's get on to colour. So there's colour wavelengths. Quickly, colour breaks down into two fundamental systems. The diachromatic system, which is, we have free colour vision, as you can see up here. So we have what's called trichromatic system. We're sensitive to 3 different colour wavelengths of light, red, green, and blue. But that's not always the way we were. 100 million years ago, we had a primordial system, which is a dichromatic system, which is just sensitive to yellow and blue light. And it was really like a daylight tracking system. And then we developed this red-green spectrum, and that was, as I mentioned earlier, it's what's like an object detector vision. So it's like really for foraging for red berries and green undergrowth. So most of the food sources that we eat are on the warmer scale of this spectrum. So most foods we eat are kind of on a reddy orange scale. So we developed this secondary system in order to forage for food. So we have a kind of a dual system. One of them, as I say, is a light detecting system, which tracks the time of day, and is very closely related to our moods. So our sexual appetites, our whole what we call the circadian rhythm, how we feel about things, and how awake we feel. It's all very closely controlled by that dual system. And then the second system is responsible for us being able to forage for food effectively, and also to notice another social indicator is how ruddy someone's skin is, how much blood there is in someone's skin. Would give an indication of if they're angry or if they're sexually aroused, and that's another indication we look for when we're looking at skin. So the colour pierces directly into our limbic system. So they did a psychological study recently when they realised that the facts are that blue-grey light makes us feel sadder, when yellow-orange light makes us actually feel more joyful. So it's basically our nervous system has co-evolved with these two visual colour processes. So it doesn't surprise me as cinematographers when we're looking at how we apply colour has a huge emotional impact. And to be aware of that, to just notice your mood when you're looking at different colours or different times of day, to notice that and to be, as I say, to be able to recreate that is really important. So let's look at skin now. So there's a test that they did at the University of Nottingham. And there's 3 images here. So the first image is the woman as she was, the man as he was. Then they put them under a sunbed. And then they changed their diet to produce more of the antioxidant carotene in their skin. Which one do you find most attractive looking at these? Is it the one on the right? Yeah. And that's as I say, centre's the sunbed, the one on the right's the carotene levels. And this is not to do with melanin, so it applies to every race. It's just to do with carotene levels. So you give someone more vegetables, and they're going to look more attractive to you. And this is, like I say, a very subconscious process. So we're actively attracted or repulsed to someone through the colours in their skin. And this is really important in cinematography when it comes to using modern light fixtures like LED light fixtures. I came from a history of using analog lights, so I used a lot of tungsten, and a lot of big DOPs still now use tungsten, and the reason for that is it's a full spectral response, so you get every colour in the skin reflected back, right? Now, if you use some poor quality LEDs, what happens is you have a spiky spectral response, and not every colour in the skin is reflected back, and because of that, even when you get to the grade, you can't grade those colours out, you can't get them back, because there's actually no energy there to get them back. So that's really important. When you're thinking of skin, it's very, very important what light you use to light someone's skin, and to be aware of the deeper-rooted unconscious effects of the colour of skin has on how we read that character. So let's quickly go on, because I haven't got long now, so I've got 2 minutes. I don't know how we're going to do this. So this is a real quick one. Colour consistency, it's like an auto-white balance. So we see that as a bowl. Whoop, let's go back. Can we reset that? Let me try. So that's like a bowl of lemons. We see that as a bowl of lemons, even though the colour's not right. It's very, very blue light that's lighting those. But we kind of somehow we phase that out with our auto system. That's it under correct lighting conditions. And then if you see them side by side, which is coming, you'll see that one's obviously a lot bluer light, but we still see them as both bowls of lemons. But if you compare one of the lemons to the other lemon, hopefully it will switch across now. You'll see that it's in fact more like a lime, because we have this way of phasing it out. So that's it in the context there of the lemons. So that's our way of, and the way that happens is through something called chromatic adaptation, right? And so I've got one more last study to show you. So this one, if you look at the centre circle here, now you've got to really stare at this. Now, what I've done here is I put on some complementary colours. Now, just please, everyone, stare at that centre. Don't take your eyes off it. Don't blink. Don't blink. Just stare at it. Keep staring at it. And what will happen, it's going to switch back to the black and white image. But through your colour adaptation, you're going to notice the colour image. So keep staring at it, please. Don't take your eyes off it for this to work. It's very important you keep staring at it. And when the image switches, carry on staring at it. Okay, so hopefully keep staring, keep staring. And the moment you look away, it goes back to... Now, that's a combination of what's called chromatic adaptation, which is your brain zeroing out your cones to try and create the complementary colours for it to look like a natural white. And the second thing that's happening is a thing called memory colour. So at the end of this, I'm going to show you the actual picture here. And it's Dunstanburgh Castle. And people who hadn't been to Dunstanburgh Castle had an effect of that. I don't know, has that gone back to the beginning again? Oh, sorry, there's colour images at the end of that to show you how close your chromatic adaptation had brought you to something that most of you probably hadn't seen before in reality. Okay, oh, that's that. So, so the next thing to talk about is the last, actually, I've flied through some of this, so hang on, where are we now? So the other thing to talk about is our temporal perception of how we see. So, as I mentioned earlier, we have this foveal perception, and we have the saccades where we move our eyes around very rapidly. Now, we don't experience the world like that. We experience it more of like a gimbal shot. It's more of a smooth, sort of moving shot. But if we feel the eye, as we did earlier, we can feel the eye's actually not doing that at all. So there's a temporal buffering happening in our eye. And we think actually that we're here, I'm talking in reality to you, and you're seeing me live now, and we're all seeing the now moment. We're all seeing in reality. Well, that's actually not true. We're actually seeing 15 seconds in the past, which is just a bit mind-blowing, isn't it? So what we do is we create a 15-second buffering of the last 15 seconds of the snapshots that we're catching, and we're composing. We're making a composite in our mind of what we think is deemed important, what's not important. And we're seeing, as a result of that, we're seeing a smooth vision. So this is quite important with cinematography, as I think we experience in the world much like a gimbal shot. So we're sort of smoothly moving through the world, like a kind of floating experience. Our eyes feel like they're kind of in some kind of gimbal, and we're smoothly floating through the world. And that's why handheld, which actually should be more... Yeah, okay, I haven't got long. So handheld should be more of our real experience of vision, when it's not. It's actually more jagged, more kind of emotionally kind of stressful experience. So we can use that to our effect. We can use handheld for the emotional impact of it rather than actually giving us a direct POV, and then we can use, say, a tracking shot, which is more solid than a gimbal shot, as another emotional impact. But I'm going to have to fly through a few pages here and just sum up now, which is unfortunate, because I had a really great point at the end, but hey-ho. So in summing up, basically, we as filmmakers, we're filtering reality. That's what we're doing as a filmmaker. We're filtering everything that's out there and creating something to try and move other people's emotions. And what's actually happening to us is we're being filtered by evolutionary biology as well. So we think we're filtering as filmmakers, but actually the filtering's already happening to us. So to become aware of that unconscious happening of how we filter the world, and to start trying to apply that to the way we try and move other people's emotions with filmmaking I think is a really useful point. So it's like you consider something, you notice how you see something, how your emotions are being moved as you're seeing this phenomena, and then you try and you consider it, and then you try and reconstruct that on a film set. So notice how you see and apply that to how you make films. This is one image here I just wanted to say. So this is going back to our chromatic adaptation, and it's just showing you a couple of frames of famous paintings. And then just my point here is showing how famous artists are very good at shutting off the chromatic adaptation. So what they do is they see the colours that are kind of more innate in what they're looking at, and they try and exaggerate them for artistic effect. So the fact we try and phase everything out to be white, our eyes are doing that. Sometimes it's very useful as cinematographers not to see that, and to try and see that innate colour in things, and to try and phase out your chromatic adaptation. And finally, I just want to make a couple of points here so that we've done the temporal perception. I was going to make some points about the future of cinematography. I'll make them very, very briefly. So it's very interesting to sort of look at what's happening with software emulation at the moment, with AI, with colour science and everything, and how that's being led mainly in the virtual world, in the software world. Manufacturers are kind of reaching a kind of optimum level of being able to manufacture lenses, being able to manufacture sensors, much like what happened with laptops. And now we're moving to a world of AI, a world of CG, a world of kind of computer emulation. And I think that's going to be the future of cinematography, how that real world and how the virtual world combine. So if you look at something like The Mandalorian, you'll see that they make a virtual set here, I'm involved in building some of these sets at the moment, and what we're doing, we're very interested in what is real and what is virtual, and trying to make those two worlds very, very seamless. So, for example, colour science, when we look at the like what's called a Planckian curve, how we create very good colours in LEDs, we're looking at that with the light technology, but also looking at that with the screen technology, so it all emulates perfectly. And we're using the same kind of algorithms and everything with the actual physical lights, and we're building those in 3D as well, and trying to have that real virtual kind of transition as smooth as possible. And then just to finally sum up, as I mentioned, we're filtering reality all the time, so just become aware of that. And I should mention I do a Instagram breakdown. It's called Set Notes, and what I do is I do a triptych. When the first post, I usually frame shots from the actual commercial, and then the second one is a relationship between the actual shoot and the recce, so you can see how the lighting has changed the image, and how the choice of lens and whatnot has changed the image. And the third one is actually a breakdown of all of the equipment we use. As I mentioned, I'm using kind of less equipment now than I was before, smaller lights, more precise lighting, and different lighting techniques that we break it all down here. And then the final thing to mention is we're starting to do a podcast. It's going to be in a central London location with one, I can't say which, but one of the booths outside is our partner, and we're going to be doing it maybe monthly. And I'm interested in bringing on industry experts and talking to them about much like the stuff we spoke about now, and trying to just develop that further. And then I'm involved in a collective called Light Club, and we're very interested in the latest technologies in cinematography. We write, direct, shoot commercials, and if anyone wants to get in touch with us, we're always looking for people to collaborate with, so we'd love to hear from you. And that's it. So, thank you. Not bad for timing, eh? I'm just looking at the clock. It says 0000. It's probably been like